As I read this, this states a view of public justification that applies to ideal and actualist public justification. Rawls here draws on the link between public justification and reflective equilibrium in order to suggest that a conception of political justice can be publicly justifiable to reasonable citizens only if that conception can attain an overlapping consensus between the reasonable comprehensive doctrines that these citizens endorse. If we apply this to actualist public justification, the overall idea seems to run as follows. First, phi, the conception of justice or political justice, is APJ justifiable, that is, meets the test of actualist public justification only if phi is coherently acceptable by each actual reasonable citizen in reflective equilibrium. However, second, reasonable citizens accept reasonable but incompatible comprehensive doctrines, and to be coherently acceptable by these citizens, phi must be able to cohere with these doctrines. However, third, if phi does cohere with the reasonable comprehensive doctrines of reasonable citizens, then phi attains a reasonable overlapping consensus. Accordingly, fourth, phi is APJ justifiable or can meet the test of actualist public justification only if phi can attain a reasonable overlapping consensus. This line of thought suggests two general points. First, actualist fundamental public justification does not compete with the aim of reasonable overlapping consensus. Rather, to attain a reasonable overlapping consensus is a condition of actualist public justification. And the second point is this: a reasonable overlapping consensus is relevant for Rawls not just because of its contribution to social stability. A more fundamental issue is the public justifiability and hence the reasonableness of conceptions of political justice. Now, let me add another remark for those of you who know Rawls's position a little bit more closely. You will have noticed that Rawls claims that an overlapping consensus should be sought only in conditions of reasonable pluralism. This is consistent with the reading I have just suggested. Rawls uses more than one notion of reasonable pluralism. And on one of these notions, a reasonable pluralism can obtain in actual or non-ideal societies when at least some of the comprehensive doctrines that are then adopted are reasonable. For Rawls, political liberalism seeks an overlapping consensus only in relation to these reasonable doctrines. So the idea of reasonable pluralism is mostly understood as referring to an ideal reasonable pluralism where we think of a society, pluralist society, in which comprehensive doctrines are being affirmed, and all the doctrines that are being affirmed are reasonable. Arguably, this condition only holds within an ideal or hypothetical well-ordered society as Rawls pictures it at the second stage of justice as fairness. However, Rawls also works with a non-ideal conception of reasonable pluralism, and that is the idea of reasonable pluralism that can be satisfied in actual non-ideal societies where not all comprehensive doctrines are reasonable. For more details on this point, please consult the primary lecture reading. All right, a brief recap. What did we talk about? We talked about ideal and actualist public justification. They differ in relation to the sort of people that carry out public justification and the social context, the background assumptions associated with the practice of public justification. Relevant for my purposes here is only actualist public justification, where public justification is a practice of reason giving between actual people that occurs in actual societies. Then I distinguish between conception dependent and conception constraining equal respect. or the latter, conception constraining equal respect, I dubbed discursive respect. In one relevant way, these two ways of thinking about equal respect differ in relation to the status in justification of the commitment to equal respect. Conception-dependent equal respect is equal respect that gets its content and direction, if you wish, from an allegedly reasonable conception of justice. To exercise equal respect in that sense requires us to already have a reasonable conception of justice. So to respect others is then to act in accordance with what that conception prescribes. So it's conception dependent. This is not the kind of equal respect that matters here. In conception constraining equal respect, the commitment to show one another equal respect constrains which conceptions of justice we consider to be reasonable in the first place. Equal respect here is tied to giving others a say on which conception of justice may govern interactions with them, e.g. in the political domain. Equal respect so construed is tied to having others impact or influence which conceptions of justice we pick to regulate our shared affairs, if you wish. Right? That is what I refer to here as discursive respect. And that's the kind of thing that I claim is fundamental in political liberalism and that finds expression in political liberalism's commitment to general reflective equilibrium or actualist and fundamental public justification. Accordingly, I distinguish between several levels of argument in Rawls's political liberalism. We are only focusing on one level of argument, what I think of as the fundamental level of argument, where Rawls argues that only a political liberal conception of justice can be reasonable in a sense. Okay, currently I talked about actualist and fundamental public justification. I looked at the idea of reflective equilibrium at one level of thought in order to attribute to Rawls the view that conceptions of political justice depend for their reasonableness on being equally acceptable coherently by actual reasonable citizens. Against that background, I briefly considered the role of the original position and the role of reasonable overlapping consensus. If indeed there's actualist and fundamental public justification in Rawls, then the original position cannot be fundamental in its justification job. The reading I suggested would have it that the original position is a reconstructive device. And the later Rawls often speaks about or talked about the original position in terms that very strongly suggest that it does have this reconstructive role. Not least, I pointed out just now that the aim of reasonable overlapping consensus does not compete with actualist and fundamental public justification, but rather is a condition of actualist and fundamental public justification. Okay, with this, I will now turn to the exclusion objection.